Okay, well, our next speaker needs no introduction, but he's going to get one anyway. Ronald Loeffler is currently at Grand Valley State University, author of a very fine book about Brandom, and obviously one of the leaders of our conference. And he's going to speak to us about moral we intentions as individualistic we attitudes. Ronald.
Thank you, Heath. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it? Okay. Oops. All right. Thank you very much for sticking around for my talk on a Saturday in the middle of the day or in the evening. I really appreciate that, your attendance. And so I'm going to focus on the same, my talk is going to have a similar focus as Stephanie's talk and Kyle's talk yesterday. I'm going to focus on the issue what Sellarsian moral we-intentions are. And in particular, I'm going to be concerned in my talk to give an individualistic account of moral we-intentions on Sellars' behalf, on the Sellars of science and metaphysics. And by individualism, I simply mean here that a subject may morally we-intend that P, or by him or herself. So this, at first blush, sounds like a radical discrepancy, a disagreement with Jeremy's paper that we just heard of, but in fact, I don't think it is. I mean, this is a very modest individualistic thesis. I'm not denying that a subject may morally we-intend that P only against the background of socially shared reasons with other. I'm not denying that, socially shared norms, okay, but it's still possible, and maybe as far as morality is concerned, quite common, although lots of other norms and reasons have to be shared. So as I just indicated, I'm focusing mainly on the Sellars of science and metaphysics. And there he identifies or labels the distinguishing feature of moral we-intentions and we-intentions in general as intersubjective form. So my talk is concerned with giving an account of intersubjective form that Sellars could have adopted, the Sellars of science and metaphysics could have adopted. Apropos Stephanie's paper, I agree with Stephanie that in later phases of his work, in particular on reasoning about value, the approach that I'm going to propose wouldn't be one that fits that approach very well. So I'm focusing mainly on the Sellars of science and metaphysics. So in science and metaphysics, Sellars characterizes, oh, by the way, so what I'm going to say, I hope that this dovetails, I think it dovetails with what Kyle proposed in his paper. I mean, Kyle honed in on intersubjective form from the perspective of ascriptions of the intentions. And so the takeaway was that there are ascriptions that I can intend as one of us. And those ascriptions are ascriptions of we intentions. So I think my talk may dovetail with that and illuminate further as to what it means to intend as one of us. So again, science and metaphysics, the distinguishing feature of moral we intentions is intersubjective form. And due to this feature, moral we intentions do two things, as Sellars suggests in science and metaphysics. They make a claim to categorical reasonableness. In other words, they make a certain claim on any rational being to be accepted or shared. And due to this, they allow for genuine interpersonal agreement and disagreement in moral matters, something that Sellars thinks in science and metaphysics cannot be done with I intentions. We cannot genuinely interpersonally disagree insofar as we form I intentions. So This is going to be the topic of my paper. And here's my thesis regarding intersubjective form. I'm laying it out. And then in the second part, I'm going to elaborate it, motivate it, and defend it against a couple of objections. So my thesis is, it's a suggestion on behalf of the Sellars of Minds in Science and Metaphysics, is this: the intersubjective form of a token moral we-intention, that P, consists in the intentions intrinsically involving qua state or attitude, as opposed to qua contentful state, a normative attitude towards all rational beings, all of us jointly, to aim to help realize P. Couple of preliminaries. So I'm going to focus in this talk exclusively on moral we intentions, where the we is used in the most encompassing sense. It covers all rational beings, not focusing on we intentions regarding more narrow groups here. I make an interpretive assumption that I'm not going to defend it, namely that the Sellars of Science and Metaphysics identifies moral we intentions with moral judgments. It's a certain reductive view about moral judgments, according to which moral judgments are moral we intentions. That's the classical way in which Sellars has been interpreted, but that interpretation has recently come under challenge, for example, by Stephanie in her 2019 synthese paper. She offers an alternative account of moral judgments or moral claims. And I think Preston's account of deontic judgments is incompatible with these readings, because Sellarsian moral we intentions don't involve the distinction between choosing single-mindedly and choosing indifferently. But anyway, I'm setting all this aside, and for the purposes of this paper, stick with a classical reductive interpretation here. Now, a limitation is that I'm going to focus only on we intentions that P, we intentions that something be the case, setting on one side we intentions to do. So I'm focusing only on the shall be intentions, we intentions. And then one question is how my proposal might extend to intentions to do. And yeah, I say nothing about that in that paper. My main textual basis, as already mentioned, is Science and Metaphysics. Here's the roadmap. In the first part, I recapitulate certain things Sellars says about ordinary intentions, and then also about wishes and desires, as well as beliefs. Second part introduces my main proposal. I focus on intentions with intersubjective form. And then in the third part, I want to show how this proposal, on this proposal, there is a sense in which such intentions make a certain claim to categorical reasonableness and therefore allow for genuine interpersonal agreement and disagreement. So part one, a little bit about ordinary intentions, wishes, desires, and beliefs. And we've heard quite a bit of this already yesterday. So yeah, I can go through that relatively briefly. Whoops. My PowerPoint isn't working anymore. Okay, here it goes. So ordinary intentions, I intentions, norms of practical reasoning, according to Sellars, tie them to other intentions, to actions. So they are in the space of reasons in the sense that they are tied by norms of reasoning to other intentions and actions. So since they are tied normatively to action, Sellars said that ordinary intentions, actually all intentions, have a conceptual tie to practice. Sellars explicates these norms of practical reasoning in his Logic of Intentions that Heath's paper focused on a couple of days ago. And basically, this logic of practical reasoning is a logic of means-end reasoning. So the logic does tell us that we shouldn't hold, a subject shouldn't hold mutually incompatible intentions. So we shouldn't intend mutually incompatible goals simultaneously. But beyond that, the logic simply tells us, given that we have certain intentions, what else we ought to intend, or my intent, by way of means to achieving these ends that are set by the intentions that we already have. The logic of intentions Sellars develops in terms of an analysis of statements expressing intentions, those shall statements. And so just an example here. So if I intend that my kitchen shall be clean tonight, Sellars would analyze this as this: shall, square bracket, my kitchen will be clean, where the shall here expresses my token attitude of intending. And the chunk in the square brackets expresses the content of the intention here, where the content simply represents a possible future state of affair, that my kitchen will be clean. Shall expresses the token attitude of intending. So as Kyle pointed out yesterday and elaborated in detail, these statements are not ascriptions of intentions. I'm not self-ascribing an intention here insofar as I make this statement. So in other words, the shall here is not a cognitive predicate denoting states of intending. It's rather more like an indication of force of the statement. It expresses the token attitude of intending that I have. So my statement is a first order statement regarding the state of my kitchen, not a second order statement about what I intend. A little bit about wishes and desires, according to Sellars, just a little bit. Wishes, according to Sellars, constitute a subject's valuings. So when I value something, I wish for it. And Sellars says that wishes are expressed by would, where the would functions parallelly to the shall that expresses intentions. Just as shall expresses attitudes of intending, would expresses attitudes of wishing. So for example, if I wished that my kitchen had been clean last night, I would express that wish, would, my kitchen would have been clean last night. And of course, we have two woulds here, but don't be confused. This would here in the square brackets, that just indicates that the state of affairs that's represented in the square brackets is a counterfactual past state of affairs. The key would expressing the wishing is this would here outside the square brackets on the left expresses my attitude of wishing. Desire, Sellars says, simply wishes that the subject believes can be fulfilled. So assuming that my kitchen was dirty last night, the wish that I express here would be a mere wish, because I don't think that I can change the past. Now wishes, like desires too, have a conceptual tie to practice, Sellars emphasizes. They too rationally constrain agency and are in the space of reasons, therefore. I mean, even this, we can even think of this wish regarding the past cleanliness of my kitchen as having a very indirect tie to practice, in the sense that, well, if I somehow could travel back in time 24 hours, I could keep that wish, and then, well, it would be a wish about the future, right? Let's say I'm landing yesterday at noon, and then it would motivate my action, or would exert motivational force on my action, or would, and where the motivational force is understood in normative terms. It normatively constrains how I ought to act. Of course, there may be overriding other practical reasons for leaving my kitchen dirty, but it at least ceteris paribus leads to action, or should lead to action. Sellars says nothing about the logic of, as far as I know, of practical reasoning regarding wishes, including desire. So, and it seems like that the silence, I mean, to me indicates I'm making this interpretive claim very cautiously and reluctantly. It seems like he thinks that the same logic logic that governs intentions also governs wishes and desires. I do this very cautiously, and I'd be very happy to be enlightened by those of you who know these aspects of his work better. Because, I mean, this interpretive claim, I mean, if Sellars made it, maybe as an interpretive claim, it's all right, but it seems false, this claim. There's nothing irrational to hold incompatible wishes, I think, but there is something irrational about holding incompatible intentions. But anyway, nothing about what I'm going to say hangs on this interpretation. nothing of the core of what I want to say. Still, assuming this interpretation, we can make a terminological choice here. We can just use intention in a generic sense, according to which the term covers any cognitive attitude at all with a conceptual tie to practice, including wishes and desires. So we have generic intentions, cognitive states with a conceptual tie to practice, contrasted with cognitive states that lack such a tie, like beliefs and assumptions. And then we can botanize intentions in that generic sense into intentions narrowly conceived, wishes, desires, and so forth. So when in the following, when I use intentions without qualification, I mean to use it in this broad sense. The key feature of ordinary intentions, or I intentions, is that they have a limited presence in the space of reasons. Sellars says in Science and Metaphysics that they are only hypothetically reasonable or unreasonable. In other words, reasonable or unreasonable relative to the subject's collateral intentions. They are never reasonable or unreasonable in their own right. As Sellars says, they are never categorically or per se reasonable or unreasonable. And I think this picture follows from the fact that the logic of intentions is merely a logic of means ends reasoning. So it only tells us what it is rationally to intend, given that we have certain collateral intentions already, certain more general aims, but it's never rational in its own right to form an intention. So it seems to me that as far as I intentions or ordinary intentions are concerned, Sellars agrees with the famous Humean dictum that it's not unreasonable to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. It's not unreasonable per se, if that's my overarching intention, to help destroy the whole world as much as I can. It's only unreasonable relative to collateral intentions that I may have, such as an intention to promote the flourishing of humankind, or at least the flourishing of my kin and their descendants. Sip of water. A consequence of this limited presence of ordinary intentions in the space of reasons is that two subjects holding mutually incompatible ordinary intentions, if they are in such a situation, the situation does not imply that any mistake is committed. So for example, if you intend that my kitchen shall be clean tonight, and I intend that it shall not be clean, even though our two intentions are incompatible in the sense that both of our goals cannot be achieved, so the contents of the intentions logically contradict each other. Nevertheless, our situation here does not imply that anyone makes any mistake. After all, your intention may be perfectly reasonable relative to your collateral intentions, and mine may be perfectly hypothetically reasonable relative to mine. And then there is no further question to be asked, which of the two intentions is really reasonable? In other words, reasonable in its own right. So given this, our situation here, despite the incompatibility of the content of the goals that we have, does not imply that any mistake is committed by any one of us here. So Sellars, using, I think, Stevenson's term, calls these situations with mutually incompatible contents, where no mistake is committed, disagreements in attitude. So given that the situation implies no mistake, a fortiori, it does not impose any obligations on us to reconcile our aims or values, not even prima facie obligations. There is no sense in which we ought to adjust our goals to each other. Maybe prudent to do it, but there's nothing to rationally recommend that we ought to do it. In this regard, ordinary intentions contrast starkly with beliefs. Beliefs are objectively correct or incorrect per se, true or false. And hence two subjects expressing to each other mutually incompatible beliefs clash logically in the sense that their situation does imply that a mistake is committed. in contrast to the parallel situation in I intentions. So for example, if you believe about the future, that my kitchen will be clean tonight, and I believe that it will not be clean tonight, then our situation implies that at least one of those beliefs is mistaken. By the way, these statements here, yeah, I mean those to be analogous to shell statements. So the true is meant here to express the attitude of belief, and the square bracketed chunks, the contents believed. But not only does the situation here imply a mistake, but Sellars seems to think that the situation also does impose a prima facie obligation on us to resolve the issue regarding the future state of my kitchen. So we ought to adjust our doxastic attitudes one way or another. That is what the situation prima facie obliges us to do. Of course, it doesn't oblige us all things considered. We may have much more pressing and important things to do that merit much more attention than trying to sort this out here. But still the obligation is prima facie. So how can we explain that according to the Sellars of Science and Metaphysics? Well, Sellars indicates that he thinks of truth as a special case of categorical reasonableness. Science and Metaphysics, page 210. So he seems to think that a proposition, if it's true, just because it's true, it makes a certain claim to be assented to by any rational being. That's what is meant by categorical reasonableness. He also suggests 2 pages earlier that beliefs themselves, in a different sense, also come with a claim to categorical reasonableness. Now, of course, that's not right if we regard a false belief in its own right, abstracting from any epistemic considerations that may speak for that belief, although it's false. So in its own right, a false belief doesn't come with, in any sense, with a claim to categorical reasonableness. But I suggest the following interpretation of this claim, that there's a different sense in which they do come with such a claim. Namely, they come so from the perspective of the believer holding the belief, even if it's false, and as well as from the perspective of someone exposed to an expression of that belief, one of those true statements here, right? I mean, from the believer holding a false belief that P, although P is in fact false, the believer holds P true just by taking the belief attitude towards it. And so to that believer, P appears to be categorically reasonable, and hence as something that makes a certain claim on any rational being to be accepted. Relatedly, someone exposed to the believer's expression of that belief, true P, although that believer may reject that, at least the statement advances P to the hearer, to the addressee, as something categorically reasonable, because the true expresses the attitude of belief. So P is advanced as something true, hence is categorically reasonable, and thus the statement makes a certain claim to be assented to on the hearer. Now, of course, the hearer may have all sorts of excellent reasons for rejecting that claim. Still, it comes with that claim. So I think if we think of truth and beliefs along these lines, it follows that a logical clash such as yours and mine up here, that situation, if we are aware of it, imposes a prima facie obligation on us to adjust our doxastic attitudes one way or another to each other regarding my kitchen. All right, part 2, intensions with intersubjective form. That's the main topic of my paper. So the Sellars of Science and Metaphysics, on the classical reading, which I follow, wants to say that a moral judgment is a certain kind of intention. Moral judgments are not beliefs. They are intentions. And Sellars wants to say that because he wants to be a motivational internalist of sorts. And for him, what that means is he wants moral judgment to be a cognitive state that has a normative tie to practice. And so it's got to be an intention, not a belief. But he also wants to say, Kant, that moral judgments are belief-like in potentially giving rise to interpersonal disagreement, unlike ordinary intentions. And they do give rise potentially to interpersonal disagreement because moral judgments and the shell statements expressing them come with a certain claim to categorical reasonableness. And so this feature is due to which moral intentions come with a claim to categorical reasonableness. He calls intersubjective form. It's that feature due to which we can genuinely interpersonally disagree. So here are a couple of passages by Sellars on intersubjective form. I offer an interpretation and then an elaboration of that interpretation. Those are famous passages, parts of which, I mean, at least among us, they are not famous amongst philosophers in general, but amongst the 2 dozens of us here, they are. So from Science and Metaphysics, pages 220, 21, here Sellars says the following on intersubjective form. What is to be the expressive counterpart of the ascription Smith values from a moral point of view, blah, 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 blah. The answer suggests itself. We would that, blah, blah. Roughly, to value from a moral point of view is to value as a member of the relevant community, which as far as the present argument is concerned, I shall assume to be mankind generally, all rational beings. Notice that the above sentence, which expresses a valuing, meaning the second one here, we would that, must not be confused with the plural value ascription, we value such and such. It is still an individual who is valuing, but he is valuing in terms of we. And then a little later, we may well, indeed often do, differ in what we value as members of the community. Yet in principle, there could be agreement. We would that lacks the logical privacy of I would that. So I'm taking at least, oh, there's another one, related one. Yeah, the values which are expressed by ethical statements are universal in 3 dimensions in their content. And some of the talks yesterday focused on that. I'm setting that aside. But B, in their subjective form, i.e. their logical intersubjectivity, we would that. And then C may be important later on too, in their objectivity, namely that there is in principle a decision procedure with respect to specific ethical statements. Anyway, 4 things we can take away from that at least. First of all, Sellars thinks that intersubjective form is a certain first-person plural feature indicated by we, where the we includes all rational beings, at least for moral intentions. And it's a feature of moral intentions qua states or attitudes, as opposed to content, a feature of content. And moreover, I'm putting those 2 together, an intrinsic feature of moral intentions qua states of attitudes. Why is that? Because Sellars says that we would that or we shall that expresses that feature. And he makes clear in the context of his introduction of shell statements and the ways he distinguishes shell statements from ascription of beliefs, that he takes these kinds of expressions as expressions of attitudes. So surely if Sellars thought that intersubjective form is an extrinsic feature of moral intentions, maybe a feature that arises due to having collateral belief or mutual recognition, Sellars would have said so, but he doesn't. So he says it's expressed by the expression that expresses the attitude. Lastly, Sellars also indicates in those passages that we intentions, moral we intentions, are ontologically individualistic. So that even though they have that first person plural feature, it's possible for someone to morally we intend all by themselves. No one else shares that we intention. As far as I can see, Sellars does not say much more about what he means by intersubjective form in Science and Metaphysics. And I want to offer now an elaboration on his behalf of a suggestion of what he could have meant, how he could have elaborated. And I find the elaboration really interesting. So my proposal is this on behalf of Sellars, that when one forms a token moral intention that P, one ipso facto does 2 things. First of all, old news, one sets P as a goal, Well, that's simply because one forms an intention. But here's a new bit. That's my proposal, that when one morally V-intends that P, one not only sets P as a goal, but one also ipso facto treats P, the state of affairs at P, as a goal that we jointly ought to realize, where the we includes all rational beings. So in other words, my suggestion is that when one morally V-intends that P, one ipso facto takes a certain normative attitude towards any rational beings at all, namely to help realize the very goal that is set by intending it oneself. And I'm thinking of this normative attitude here as built into the attitude of we intending. So it's a feature of the attitude or the state of attitude of we intending. It's not a feature of the content of the intention, nor a feature of collateral cognitive states. It's built into the cognitive attitude itself, that normative attitude. So we get two different kinds of attitudes of intending, right? That's the mode account. So we get I intending, where you set P simply as a goal, and then we intending, moral we intending, where you only not set it as a goal, but also normatively expect that everybody ought to pursue that goal as well, everybody else. That's the proposal. That's what I propose Sellars could have, how Sellars could have interpreted intersubjective form, that concept of intersubjective form. Well, if nothing else, I want to say that this proposal accords with the four features of intersubjective form Sellars mentioned in those quotes. First of all, it's clearly a first-person plural feature that we jointly here. Second of all, it's a feature of the intending qua attitude, and indeed an intrinsic feature, as I just have elaborated, right? The normative attitude is built into the attitude of we intending here. So it's intrinsic in the attitude. And then it's also ontologically individualistic. I don't know whether my proposal strictly implies that, but it highly suggests that. I mean, if Smith morally we intends that P, then on my proposal, he ipso facto treats P as what we jointly ought to help realize. So Smith ipso facto takes a certain normative attitude towards us jointly, but of course it does not follow that anyone else de facto we intends that P as well. In other words, that anyone else meets this normative attitude. It's individualistic in that sense. Now that proposal raises a ton of questions, some friendly questions, others hostile. I mentioned four, and in the interest of time, I'm only answering here the first one, but I want to indicate three other questions, maybe for discussion at the end. And I want to give keywords of how I think I would like to answer those on behalf of Sellars. So the first objection, it's in fact an objection disguised as a question, is well, this proposal appears to miracles, right? How is it possible? Rhetorical question is to treat P as to be the state of affairs at P as to be realized by us jointly, simply by forming an attitude of intending with a content at P. So the objector may say, well, I can, assuming that we have a good account of concepts, including normative concepts, it may not be miraculous to explain how we can believe that we jointly ought to help realize that P, putting the ought into the content of the belief. But how can I treat unrestrictedly everybody as so obliged simply by taking an attitude? That seems like a miracle. And my answer to this would be that that's an illegitimate objection, given propositional attitude psychology. And why is that? Because we are appealing to cognitive attitudes, or at least in the framework of propositional attitude psychology, with which we all are familiar and with which we are all fairly comfortable, I take it. We constantly appeal to attitudes as doing these things that are claimed to be mysterious here. Well, in a sense, I agree. Yep, that's a deep question. How do we do these things? By taking cognitive attitudes. But I want to say, it's not just a deep question regarding my proposal, it's a deep question regarding any propositional attitude. I mean, take belief. So belief is the attitude of holding true. That's the first step into coming up with an account of belief. And so how is it possible to treat a proposition as objectively true just by taking a belief attitude towards it? It's the same kind of deep question, right? So I want to say, well, I'm just appealing to something that we anyway already do, given that we work within the framework of propositional attitude psychology. And so that's an illegitimate question. It's illegitimate to single out my proposal here on behalf of Sellars and try to dismiss it, while at the same time sticking with propositional attitude psychology. So the challenger here would be challenged to either come up with a clear account of the belief attitude and then show that there's residual mystery in my proposal regarding the intentions, or the challenge would be to come up with an alternative to propositional attitude psychology. That's how I would answer that objection. So 3 more objections, or actually questions. Well, 1 objection, 2 questions, and I only mention how I, using keywords, how I would answer them. How should we understand a we intending subject sense of us jointly? We, right? It's built into the attitude. How should we understand that? And I want to say simpliciter. So insofar as the subject forms this moral we intention, she does not discriminate between I and thou. It's a we simpliciter. We jointly simpliciter. Where does the subject sense of ought come from? Right, we jointly ought to help realize P. I want to answer this by adopting Hannah Ginsberg's normative primitivism, which she develops in the context of Wittgensteinian issues about rule following. And briefly, the idea is that the sense of ought does not come from any antecedently given moral rules or moral facts, nor does it come from any independent cognitions of such facts by the subjects. The subject has that sense of ought, but it's not further explained in terms of moral principles or moral rules or independent moral cognitions. It's in that sense primitive, Hannah Ginsberg. So I would adopt her view for this project. 4th, remember, I follow the classical interpretation according to which Sellars identifies moral we-intentions with moral judgments. And so this is an objection here. The objection is this, that I can morally judge that the board ought to publish a budget. But when I judge so, it's just not the case that I treat unrestrictedly everybody as obliged to help realize that the board publish a budget. Right? I'm not treating people in the past or in the future, or people in faraway places, or people in the wrong with certain epistemic or semantic situations as so obliged. But it seems like my proposal implies that I do. And so the challenge here is that's therefore my proposal is in trouble. At least the identification of moral we-intentions with moral judgments is in trouble, and perhaps more. And so that's a great objection, a challenge. And in response to that, I would refine the proposal of what moral we-intentions and intersubjective form are in a certain way. And I'm only giving the keyword here in terms of cognitive overriding. So we can talk about that a little bit later. Sip of water. So I want to say now a little bit about in the sense in which a moral we-intention on my proposal makes a claim to categorical reasonableness analogously to belief, and hence can give rise to genuine interpersonal agreement and disagreement. So this is just recap. A subject's moral we-intending that P intrinsically involves aspiring a realization of P, and crucially, as is treating P as what we jointly ought to help realize. So this is intersubjective form, right? So due to their intersubjective form, I want to say on my proposal, moral we-intentions and their expressions there's a sense in which they do now make a claim to practical categorical reasonableness, analogously to the way a belief makes a claim to categorical reasonableness. Remember, I mean, a belief and its expression makes a claim to categorical reasonableness in the sense that, well, from the point of view of the believer, P is true and hence something that ought to be accepted by any rational being or makes a certain claim to be accepted by any rational being. And from the point of view of someone exposed to a statement expressing of belief, the content that P is advanced as true and hence, in this sense, makes a certain claim on the addressee to endorse P by forming the belief itself. So I want to say something parallel is going on here. The claim to practical categorical reasonableness of a we intention, a moral we intention, and its expression is this, that the content that P is regarded by the we intending subject as something that we jointly ought to help realize. I want to say that that regarding is the regarding of P as practically categorically reasonable in the way in which a believer's regarding P as true is the regarding of P as theoretically categorically reasonable. And similarly, someone exposed to an expression of moral V intentions is exposed to the content that P as something that we ought to, the state of affairs of P as something that we ought to help realize. And so in that sense, P is advanced as something that's practically categorically reasonable. It makes a certain claim to be assented to by irrational beings. But of course, the assent here would not be to form the belief that P in response. The assent would be, well, to share that normative expectation on us jointly. And how do we share it? By forming in response the moral we intention ourselves. We intending that P ourselves, thereby treating P as what we jointly ought to help realize. So, and I want to say that if that is so, if moral we intentions that P make a claim to practical categorical reasonableness in that sense, then they are apt to be interpersonally agreed or disagreed with. I just want to run two examples here. So let's focus on agreement. Take two characters, Imani and Zuki, and Imani believes, morally we intends that the war will end. So it's an old story for us, slightly different cast of characters. Now, given the reductive view that moral judgments are moral we intention, the shall we here expresses the moral ought. So Imani morally judges that the war ought to end, and what that means for her, that she forms a moral we intention that the war will end. And Zuki publicly affirms in response to Imani's statement, yes. So from Imani's perspective, let's look at the situation from Imani's perspective. So she we intends that the war ought to end. She's expressed that statement, and Zuki in response to that statement affirms it, thereby indicating publicly that she shares that intention. So from Imani's perspective, a couple of things are going on. First of all, since Imani, it's crucial. I mean, Imani recognizes Zuki as one of us. Okay. So from Imani's perspective, due to all of those ingredients, she now regards that the war will end as jointly aspired to with Zuki, given her own we intention and its expression and Zuki's public affirmation. Moreover, she now treats the content that the war will end as jointly regarded with Zuki as what we all jointly ought to help realize. In other words, from Imani's point of view, that content is, she recognizes Zuki as joining her in treating that content as practically categorically reasonable. So that's what I suggest is genuine interpersonal agreement. Disagreement briefly, say a similar story. Imani says, we intends that the war ought to end and expresses it, and Zuki rejects it. We could vary it, Zuki could remain neutral, would be similar, but let's say rejects it, thereby So again, from Imani's perspective, due to her V-intention and its expression and Zucchi's public dissent, well, the basic idea here is in disagreement. We have now a situation where a normative expectation on unrestrictedly all of us is issued due to Zucchi's intention and its expression. And one of us, Zucchi, publicly rejects that normative expectation on all of us. That's the idea behind disagreement, right? Imani treats that the war shall ought to end as what we, that the war will end as what we jointly ought to help realize, and treats this normative expectation as unfulfilled by Zucchi, who is one of us. So there is a normative expectation on one of us, which is rejected by on all of us, which is rejected by one of us. And so I want to say that that is disagreement about that normative expectation that is issued, namely whether we jointly ought to help end the war. And I want to say that analogous to logical clashes in belief, that's that situation, regardless any background and whatever else is going on regarding any reasons that Imani and Zucchi have, may have for their respective attitudes regarding the issue, the situation implies that some mistake is made. Disanalogously to I intentions, namely a we intention on all of us is issued and someone rejects it. So mistake is implied here. Moreover, since it's a normative expectation, it more strongly imposes a prima facie obligation on Imani and Zucchi to resolve the mistake. What to do with that hanging normative expectation on all of us. It's very important for this project. I want to emphasize it, although I'm emphasizing this only now, that the situation underdetermines how the mistake ought to be resolved. There are three ways in which it can be resolved. Either Zucchi gets around to accept the moral re-intention, the normative expectation, Imani's, on all of us. So then the mistake is dissolved. Or Imani gets around to drop her moral re-intention and form the opposite moral re-intention, that the war will not end. Comes around to Zucchi, then there is consonance in normative expectations between the two of them. Or a third way is to just become agnostic. So both sides drop their moral re-intentions. And so that's another way of getting rid of the normative expectation that has been issued. We just withdraw it. So it's crucial that it's underdetermined. So the proposal does not, I think, imply some crazy kind of egocentrism, where the proposal would imply that everybody ought to come around to the way I see things morally, right? I mean, given that whenever we have this kind of disagreement, the situation underdetermines how it ought to go. There is no such crazy egocentrism. Now, there may still be, psychologically speaking, egocentrism. It's cognitively easier to stick one's own moral judgments than to dismiss someone else's. So there's important psychological issues here of why we tend to do that, sticking to our own views rather than always coming around to the other. But normatively, it's not required that the other come around to my view. I know I think I'm already in overtime, but I'm done. Just conclusion here, so I'm wrapping up. I've laid out my elaboration on Sellars' behalf of what he might mean by intersubjective form in science and metaphysics, namely that moral re-intentions, moral judgments, qua attitudes involve that implicit normative attitude on us jointly, all of us. That's the heart of the proposal, and that we thereby get agreement and disagreement, and actually thereby moral judgments or moral re-intentions and the statements expressing them become subject of public scrutiny and public inquiry. So I've made that proposal. Of course, the proposal invites a ton of further questions. First of all, how does that relate to intentions to do? That's a big question, actually. I've started thinking about that, but not much. So that's the way in which the project needs to be elaborated. How does this proposal relate to Sellars' alleged fundamental principle of morality, that we all ought to have the overarching moral re-intention that each and all of us or to promote the welfare of any and all of us. Proposal so far says nothing about that. How does this relate to Sellars' naturalism? Harking back to Jim's paper and Zach's. And then how does it relate to other attempts by Sellars to account for we intentions, particularly on reasoning about value? And I think Stephanie has basically given the answer that on reasoning about value doesn't work out as a textual basis for motivating my proposal here. My reference, here we go.
All right, thank you, Ronald. And I apologize for not stepping in earlier. I was looking at the wrong time on the sheet. But if you'll just raise your hands, or and we'll take questions. So Nick, I guess you're first.
Hey, thanks. I want to hear about cognitive overriding, because that fourth point there was the first thing that I thought of when you gave your proposal. So can you tell us about cognitive overriding?
Yeah. So as far as my proposal is concerned, right, the issue is that if I morally we intend that P, for example, that the board that the board will publish the budget, I implicitly treat anyone unrestrictedly, everybody as obliged to help the board realize, help realize that the board published the budget. And I want to say that just as, I mean, this is an analogy. I'm not claiming here a structural sameness or some kind of isomorphism, but an analogy. So just as de facto moral obligations can be overridden by further considerations, so the subject's treatment of all of us as obliged, given her moral re-intention, can be overridden by further cognitions about the epistemic situation or the semantic situation of individuals and groups, right? So for example, if I morally we intend that the board will publish it, insofar as that is concerned, yes, I treat people in the past as morally obligated to help realize that. But then accompanying to that is a cognition that, well, they are in the past, and that overrides it. Similar with people in other different epistemic situation, or not having the concept of what a board is, etc. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Preston.
Thanks. So this is just going to be a minor point on something I've been hammering away at for a couple of years. And I appreciated you flagging my view at the beginning, but that's really, I mean, you know, if you don't make a distinction between what ought to be and what shall be, you get all kinds of problems. I mean, how are you going to account for the strong and the weak? What's the distinction between what's permitted and what's obliged? And furthermore, the claim that, you know, we shall go to war, but we ought not becomes just a straightforward contradiction, which that looks wrong. There's some kind of practical irrationality there, but it's not contradictory to say it. So this is just a way of encouraging you to take seriously the need to distinguish in a way that's more fine-grained than Sellars, the shared intention and the deontic mental state. My hope would be that by looking at the notion of single-mindedness, you might tease out ways of making sense of disagreement, because maybe the one is rejecting something that the other is not, and that would be a way of spelling it out. That would be my hope. But anyway, I'm just sort of hammering on the table that, look, we really got to take seriously a distinction here that Sellars sort of indicates with his choice attitude, but he doesn't go into enough detail. So that's it. No question, just to kind of, you know, take me seriously.
And I do, Preston, I really do. I have started thinking precisely about that issue. So which is actually why I'm not sanguine about this reductive interpretation that a Sellarsian ought to identify moral judgments with these, what I call moral intentions. So I just.
I mean, species, the way I think of it is species of a genus of practical rationality, but they're not identical.
Yeah.
Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions. One short one first. On one of your last slides, I think I'm not sure, but it was one of the last ones. You said that Imani and Suki, they disagree about whether we jointly ought to help end the war. And that would seem to indicate that this is something propositional, right? But you do not want to say that. You want to say that's an attitude, yeah, that we ought ought to help jointly that the war ends. Yeah, so that maybe was just a matter of formulation. I'm not sure. Yeah, so that's something that yeah, it just caught my eye. And then the second question is maybe a more serious one. I would like to press you a bit on this circularity issue that we discussed a bit already, because of course your proposal, say as a self-standing proposal, that's probably something which makes sense. Yeah, but as an interpretation of Sellars, does it make sense to say that a we intention is an attitude that all of us ought to jointly help realize something? Yeah, but because Sellars wants to give an account of ought statements in terms of we intentions. And now you reintroduce the ought into the we intentions. So that would not seem to be very helpful as far as Sellars' concerns are concerned. And I know that you want to say that, okay, these oughts, this ought attitude expressed in a we intention, that this is a primitive normative attitude like in Ginsberg's account, but I'm not sure that these primitive attitudes are enough to get you what you want, because Ginsberg's attitudes, these normative attitudes, they are really primitive attitudes. And just relatedly, I think that this would be an empirical proposal. Yeah, Ginsberg's thesis. Yes, that should be something which we ought to verify empirically before we can really build something on it. But because we discussed the issue whether when you treat us jointly as people who are obliged to realize something, then we treat each other already as ends and not as mere means. Yeah. Otherwise, maybe we could not use your attitude to distinguish I intentions and we intentions. So this ought, which you have there in the we intention attitude, that seems not to be a very primitive ought. It already seems to be quite sophisticated ought, like seeing others as ends in themselves and not mere means. And I'm not sure whether these primitive normative attitudes that you take from Ginsberg can do all this work. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Regarding your first little point, so I do want to say that disagreement here, the situation of disagreement is not mediated by conceptual representations on the part of the participants of the situation as one where disagreement occurs. So I do want to say that the disagreement is just a feature of the attitudes, right? I mean, so the only content that is at play is P, the only conceptual content. So that's what I want to say. Regarding the circularity issue, so normative primitivism, just background, right? That's the view that you can take a in Hannah Ginsberg, that you can take, I mean, which she develops that in the context of discussing rule following issues, Wittgenstein literature. And so the idea is that a subject treats her linguistic performance as when she counts 2, 4, 6, 8 as correct. So she takes an attitude of treating those performances as correct. But then it's key of the primitivism that this treatment by the subject of the performances as correct is not further explained in terms of antecedently or independently given semantic norms, nor in terms of antecedently or independently given cognitions by the subject of any putative semantic norm. So that's the primitivism. It's just to refuse to give any further explanation about the sense of correctness. Okay, and so by analogously, I want to say that the sense of ought is primitive in the sense that it's not explained in terms of further antecedently given moral norms or independently given cognition of putative moral norms. And so it's primitive in that sense. And so why exactly doesn't give it to me what I want? So I mean, Sellars does want to explain the moral ought, and I'm just going primitive, right? So here's one thing I do want to say. I mean, perhaps I don't know whether that's what you just had in mind, Stephanie, but I mean, Ginsburg does not appeal of a sense of us jointly, and I do appeal to that, so that's an additional bit. But arguably, she implicitly invokes that too. When I treat 2, 4, 6 as correct, someone could ask, well, correct for whom? And Ginsburg's answer is presumably I'm not just treating it as correct for me, but correct for us because of that language, although she doesn't make it explicit. So, but there's a sense of us, arguably at least, implicit in her proposal already, which would mesh with mine. I'm not sure whether that addresses the heart of your concern, though.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I think we will discuss that further anyway.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
All right, Danielle.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. I want to pick up. I think this is closely connected to Stephanie's first question, because it seems to me that this idea of I mean, I'm really sympathetic to this, but I'm a little bit worried about the formulation, what we jointly ought to help realize. And it seems to me that one could agree with the content. So I agree that the war should be ended, but perhaps I want it for personal reasons, for I intentions, like it's getting in the way of my business interests. So surely that's too strong. It seems to me that a we intention, and I want to go back and use the analogy that I used in a question to Stephanie, a we intention doesn't just intend that others help realize it, but they do it with a we intention. So if you think of beliefs, I can either just sort of speak from my experience, in my own personal experience, Kant's perceptual judgment, two things are conjoined, or I can say, no, they're conjoined in the world. Well, if somebody agrees with me, but they don't, they say, well, yeah, it's conjoined in my experience too. And I say, no, that's not enough. You ought to be judging that it is conjoined in the world. And similarly with the we intention, it seems to me, it's not enough that the person says, oh yeah, I have that I intention. No, you ought to have a we intention. So I think there could be a disagreement in attitude, even if there was agreement in content. And I think that would be a problem. And I think we jointly just doesn't capture, I think it needs to capture that extra thing. Maybe you would disagree with that, but I don't think we jointly does capture that. If that's something you think needs to be captured, that when I have a we intention, part of the scope of that is anyone ought to so intend in some sense. And that means not just the content, but also the form.
I do want to agree with this 100%. It's not enough if Imani makes a moral statement, expresses her moral intention that the war ought to end. Suki says yes, and actually the yes underdetermines what's going on in Suki's mind, right? She may just I intend that the war shall end, or she may actually form a we intention. So, and now from Imani's perspective, it's unclear that the situation is ambiguous and well, for practical purposes, it may be good enough. But I do want to say that Suki merely I intends it. What she still does not agree with is the normative expectation issued on unrestrictedly everybody. And she can agree with that in the practical mode only by forming the we intention. So actually, if she forms the I intention, even though Imani may not pick up on it, given the situation, there is still a normative expectation on us jointly left hanging. And so there's still a normative tension. It's not really resolved. And it actually can matter greatly practically, because if Suki only intends it in a personal mode, if a third person comes along and agrees with Suki, then it would be legitimate for Imani to press that third person, but it would not be legitimate for Suki, given her merely personal intention to press a third person to come around simply because those are egocentric. So I think I agree with everything.
Okay, Kyle.
Hi, Ronald. Thank you so much for that. That was there's a lot to think about there, and I hope it's not unfair for me to ask about we intendings to do. So I think there's sort of a dilemma here. Oh, sorry. Let me back up. It seems like we intendings to do, the actions that are in there can be done on one's own, right? They're like person performable actions. So if I say, we shall any of us wash our hands before dinner, right? Like washing my hands, I don't need help. I can do that on my own.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing really jointy going on there. So the dilemma, I think, is either we need two different accounts of intersubjective form, one for intendings that and another for intendings to do, or we somehow make the joint account, which suits intendings that P really well, somehow make that work for intendings to do, but the jointiness isn't there. And I was thinking that the passage from one of the passages from Language, Rules, and Behavior that Jim brought up yesterday, I think might be helpful for how we can think of we intendings to do as involving some joint accomplishment. And it's sort of like, even though each of us is washing our hands, what we're jointly producing is like a true descriptive generalization, right? Like the rule, when we comply with the rule, when each of us complies with the rule, we're sort of jointly turning it into a true descriptive generalization. So even though the actions aren't joint actions, there's some joint achievement at stake or underway. I'm wondering whether you think the account you gave now might fit in there, turn into account for we intendings to do.
Good and difficult. So here's a cheap shot, a cheap way out. And I don't know, I have to read On Reasonings About Value again. But it's a way out that you rejected yesterday in your paper, namely, it would be the way to just say that intentions to do are inferentially related to and grounded in we intentions that P, but there are I intentions actually the intentions to do. And so you get a difference in inferential role, and that's all. Okay, that would be the cheap way out. I was really happy that you rejected that, because I wanted to reject that too. And I'm not sure I can make it work. But so I intend to wash my hands in 5 minutes. And well, let's come up with a better example. Singer's early 70s paper, right? I mean, the child about to drown in a shallow pond, and I'm wearing Gucci shoes. Of course, I ought to wade in to save the child, right? So I intend, in the moral vein now, to save the child. That's an intention to do, and not even conditional, because I am already in the condition that ought to trigger the action. So I intend to wade in, saving the child. In the intersubjective mode, couldn't that, maybe that's also too cheap. Couldn't that just be, so the content of my intention is that I wade in, or something like that. And we jointly ought to help realize that I wade in. Or we jointly ought to help realize my wading in. So others, well, they shouldn't wade in themselves, right? Even if they are around, but they should support me in that action, because it's done in a moral vein. So the content would be, I wade in, everybody ought to help realize my wading in.
I was
Wouldn't that be
thinking
enough?
I'm sorry, I was thinking your wading in is a contribution to making it the case that any of us wades in circumstances like this. It's a contribution to making the rule true.
Well, we have two intentions here. The intention that anyone ought to wade in when seeing the child drowning. So I also want to intend that, of course, in a moral vein, right? That everybody ought to have that intention to do that conditional one. So I have it, and then based on that one, I intend to wade in, given that I believe I'm in that circumstances, but my intending to wade in also has itself intersubjective form. And the intersubjective form is simply my normative attitude on unrestrictedly everybody, which I can override by, since I'm pretty clever, right? I mean, doing overriding on unrestrictedly everybody to make sure that I wade in. Couldn't that be enough? It sounds kind of cheap and crude to me, so I'm not sure, but
Kyle, do you have a follow-up?
No, I just
Okay. Well, that is the last hand raised that I saw. We are 13 minutes over time. There may be more questions. I will let the organizers of the conference decide what our next steps are.